A niece went silent for a decade, then came back asking for money. This one's real. Minecraft's going, let's get into it. My younger brother passed away 10 years ago from cancer. He left behind an 8-year-old daughter at the time, my niece, the only child he ever had, and the last few months of his treatment were some of the hardest our family has ever gone through. Watching someone that young fight something that unfair, with everyone around him doing whatever they could to help, and knowing, deep down, it wouldn't be enough. I'm 52 now, so do the math. He'd have been in his early 40s when he died, gone far too young, far too fast, and it wrecked our entire family in ways that took years to even begin settling, ways some of us are honestly still settling even now. 2 years after he passed, his wife, my sister-in-law, remarried and moved out of state, taking my niece with her. I want to be fair here and say I don't blame her for moving on with her life, remarrying, or wanting a fresh start somewhere new. She was young, she had a whole future ahead of her, and staying frozen in place forever, tied to grief and to a family that reminded her of loss every single time we all got together, wasn't something anyone should have reasonably expected of her. But somewhere in that transition, my niece started pulling away from our side of the family. Slowly at first, missed calls, shorter visits, then longer stretches between contact. And it kept getting worse rather than better as time went on, even as the rest of us kept reaching out the same way we always had. Apparently, she had a genuinely positive experience with her new stepdad, someone who by all accounts stepped into that role and did right by her. And eventually, he adopted her legally, making the whole arrangement permanent in a way that, I think, made it easier for her to fully close the door on the family she'd left behind. Around that same time, she basically ghosted our entire family, told us flat out that she didn't want anything to do with us anymore. No explanation beyond that. Just a clean, final-sounding statement that none of us really knew how to respond to. She even rejected visits from my mother, her own paternal grandmother, the woman who used to babysit her every single weekend back when my brother was still alive, who kept a drawer of her favorite snacks stocked in the kitchen for years after my niece stopped visiting, just in case, never quite ready to admit to herself that those visits weren't coming back. My mother passed away herself a few months after that rejection, and honestly, we all suspect it played a real part in her death, even if there's no way to prove something like that with any real certainty. Grief, mixed with that specific kind of rejection from a granddaughter she adored, on top of losing her son a couple years earlier, it was a lot for one woman's heart to carry. And I don't think any of us fully appreciated how much she was quietly carrying until it was already too late to do anything about it. At the time all this was happening, my niece was only 15, young, but old enough, in my opinion, to understand at least some of the impact her choices were having on people who genuinely loved her. People who had done nothing except continue showing up for her the same way they always had. Anger and grief took over on our end too, if I'm being completely honest. And after a certain point, we simply stopped reaching out. Not out of spite exactly, more out of a kind of self-protective exhaustion that builds up after enough rejection. There's only so many times you can extend a hand towards someone before you start protecting yourself from getting hurt again and again by the same rejection, especially while you're already grieving someone else entirely. Years passed, a lot of them. She turned into an adult somewhere in there, without any of us really being part of it, without birthdays, without graduations, without any of the ordinary milestones families usually share with each other. Then, a couple of months ago, she reached out after all those years of complete silence. A message that landed on my phone on an otherwise completely ordinary evening. No warning, no lead-up, just there suddenly after a decade of nothing. Her first question wasn't, "How are you?" or "I'm sorry for how things went," or anything close to that. Nothing about the years in between or how any of us had been doing. It was about her share of my mother's inheritance. I told her the truth, that there was nothing left for her specifically, that everything from my mother's estate had already gone to me and my sister years earlier, through the completely normal, legal process that happens after somebody passes away without any outstanding claims sitting around waiting to be settled. No hidden account, no separate fund with her name on it that anyone had simply forgotten to mention. She did not take that well. She got angry and started cussing out my dead mother, right there in the conversation, using language about a woman who couldn't defend herself anymore, a woman who used to babysit her every weekend, and who this same niece had rejected years before her death, along with everything my mother had tried to offer her in those final years. I told her to show some respect, that whatever she felt about the family, whatever justified grievances she thought she had, My mother didn't deserve that, not after everything, not from her specifically. Not long after that exchange, she told me she was starting college and demanded financial support, framing it as her rightful share of her late father's estate, my brother's estate, as though that money had simply been sitting somewhere waiting for her to eventually claim it whenever she felt ready to come back around, untouched, growing interest, patiently waiting for exactly this moment. I was honestly taken aback by the whole request, in a way I probably shouldn't have been given how the conversation had already gone. But I still was. I told her straight out that she pushed my brother's entire family away years ago, that she has a new dad now, a whole new family who adopted her and raised her, and presumably has already been saving for her education the way any responsible parent would, and that I wasn't paying for anything on top of everything else. I also explained, plainly, that whatever inheritance had existed from my brother's estate was almost entirely gone by that point, because my brother had nothing left after years of paying for his own cancer treatments before he passed. Every last bit of it eaten up by hospital bills and specialists and treatments that in the end didn't even save him. Whatever small amount was left after that had gone toward my own children's education over the years since, money I'd been carefully saving since the day each of my kids was born, planned and budgeted for over more than a decade, not some windfall I was sitting on. My sister refused to help her financially too, which only added more tension to an already difficult situation, spreading the conflict out across the rest of the family instead of keeping it contained between just me and my niece. My niece called her a disgrace and, honestly, worse than that, words I won't bother repeating, and then tried guilt-tripping her into handing over money anyway, insisting she owed it to her somehow, that family was supposed to mean something even after everything my niece herself had done to walk away from that exact definition of family. My sister genuinely wasn't in a position to help even if she'd wanted to, since her own portion of what little inheritance existed had already gone toward paying off debts years before any of this conversation ever happened. Debts that had nothing to do with any of us and everything to do with her own life circumstances at the time. I want to be clear that my refusal wasn't coming from some place of cruelty or spite, and I've turned that over in my head more than once since all of this started, wondering if I'm being too hard on someone who was, after all, still a kid when the original rejection happened. If she'd approached any of this genuinely and with some basic politeness, acknowledging even a little bit of the distance she created and how that distance affected people on our side too, not asking for an apology exactly, just some acknowledgement that this wasn't a one-way street, I honestly think I would have found some way to help her out, even if it was modest, even if it meant tightening my own budget somewhere else for a while. I've always tried to be responsible with money throughout my life, though I've never been wealthy by any stretch, working steady but unremarkable jobs my whole career. And years of disrespect and outright demanding behavior from someone who cut us off completely made it feel impossible to just open my wallet like none of that history existed, like the last decade could simply be waved away because she suddenly needed something. I've been saving for my own kids since the day each of them was born, a little at a time, birthday money, tax refunds, whatever I could spare month to month, and the small inheritance that came my way after my mother passed only helped a little bit on top of that. It was never some large windfall sitting around waiting to be redistributed to whoever eventually asked for it first. My niece seemed to assume, going into this whole conversation, that I had significantly more to give than I actually did, maybe picturing some large sum still sitting untouched in an account somewhere with her name quietly attached to it, waiting patiently the entire decade she spent not speaking to any of us. I haven't wanted to get law enforcement involved in any of this, despite some ongoing harassment since that first conversation. Messages here and there that keep circling back to the same demands, framed slightly differently each time, sometimes angry, sometimes almost pleading, like she's testing different approaches to see which one finally works on me. Part of me still hopes, somewhere underneath all the frustration, that this eventually settles into something less hostile, even if it never goes back to what it used to be before any of this happened, back when she was small and none of this was even a possibility anyone could have imagined. I've also thought a lot over these past couple months about my former sister-in-law's role in all of this, though I try to be careful not to lay too much blame at her feet either, since I only ever see this from the outside, secondhand, filtered through whatever my niece has chosen to share with me over the years, never the full picture from someone who actually lived it day to day. From what I understand, she genuinely believed the clean break was better for my niece at the time, a fresh start, unburdened by constant reminders of loss. And maybe, from inside that decision, it felt like protection rather than severance. I don't know if she ever pushed back against my niece's decision to cut us off completely, whether she encouraged it, discouraged it, or simply stayed out of it and let her daughter make her own choices as she got older. It's one of those questions I'll probably never get a real answer to, and some days that bothers me more than others. People who've weighed in on this since I first talked about it publicly have mostly pointed out that her mother, my former sister-in-law, probably should have set aside some money specifically for college back when she remarried and moved my niece out of state, rather than my niece showing up a decade later expecting our side of the family to cover a gap that really formed somewhere else entirely, in a household we weren't even part of anymore and had no say in whatsoever. A few people suggested I should just block her entirely and be done with it, cut my losses and stop letting the harassment continue. I explained that isn't really an option for me right now, mostly because my brother genuinely had nothing left after his treatments and everything he went through at the end, and some small part of me still holds on to the hope that eventually she understands that, on her own terms, without me having to keep repeating it every single time she reaches back out with the same accusations. Looking back on the entire decade now, what actually sits with me hardest isn't even the money itself, or the specific words she used about my mother, or any single moment along the way. It's the fact that we lost basically the whole decade, the years leading up to her walking away and the years since. Years that could have held an actual relationship, an actual aunt and uncle who watched her grow up, cousins who knew her, holidays that included her, graduations we could have attended, small, ordinary Sunday dinners that never happened. And instead, all of it just sat empty while everyone waited for a different version of this conversation to happen first, each side assuming the other one needed to move first. I think about what her childhood actually looked like from the outside, the parts I know about anyway, and try to imagine what it must have felt like from her side of things, losing her father that young, then watching her whole world reshuffle itself around a move and a remarriage and a new last name and a new school and new friends, at an age where kids are already trying to figure out who they even are, without that kind of upheaval layered on top of everything else. I don't think that excuses everything that's happened since, the way she spoke about my mother especially, but I try to hold some space for it anyway, even when it's hard to. I've wondered, more than a few times, whether there's some entirely different version of this college conversation that could have gone better. One where I led with something softer before getting to the actual refusal. Some acknowledgement up front of how hard it must be starting school without either parent fully in the picture, in the way most of her classmates probably had. Before explaining why I still wasn't able to help financially, given everything. I don't know if that would have changed her reaction at all, given how angry she got almost immediately, but it's one of those small regrets that sits alongside the bigger ones. Wondering if there was a version of that conversation where both of us walked away feeling slightly less like enemies. I think about her stepdad sometimes too, someone I've never met and probably never will, wondering what he actually knows about all of this. Whether she's told him the real version of why money from our side of the family isn't coming, or some other version of events that paints things differently. Maybe one where I come across as simply cold, rather than someone weighing a decade of context. I don't hold anything against him personally, whatever kind of father he's been to her, by all accounts a good one. But there's something strange about a stranger effectively taking over a role that used to belong to my own brother. And I don't think that strangeness ever fully goes away, no matter how much time passes. I don't know if she'll ever fully understand how her rejection landed on my mother specifically, how directly it seemed to line up with her decline at the end, the way her health seemed to slip a little further every time another visit request went unanswered. I've never said that to my niece outright, that we blame her in any real way for how things unfolded with my mother's health, because grief isn't something you can prove came from one single source. There were other factors too, her age, her own health history, the accumulated weight of losing a son. And piling that particular weight onto a 15-year-old, even one who'd already caused real hurt, never felt like the right thing to do. Not back then, and not now. But it sits there anyway, in the back of my mind, every time this whole situation comes up again. Every time I think about my mother's last few months, and how much quieter that house got once the visits stopped entirely. I still think about the little girl she used to be before any of this happened. The one my mother used to watch every single weekend without fail, running around my parents' backyard, completely unaware that any of this was coming for her family years down the road. Splashing in that little inflatable pool my dad set up every summer, laughing about nothing in particular the way little kids do. That version of her and the adult who called my dead mother names in the middle of demanding money feel like two entirely different people to me most days. And I genuinely don't know how to hold both of those versions in my head at the same time without it hurting more than I expect it to every single time I try. My own kids have grown up hearing pieces of this story over the years. Enough to understand there's a cousin out there they've never really known. Someone who exists more as a name, mentioned occasionally at family gatherings, than an actual person in their lives. A kind of family ghost story that never quite gets a proper ending. My youngest asked me once, a few years back, why we never see her. And I remember struggling to find an answer that was honest, without turning into something that sounded like I was bad-mouthing someone she'd never even met. I ended up saying something vague about grown-up things being complicated sometimes, which felt like a cop-out even as I said it. But I didn't have a better answer ready at the time, and I'm not sure I do now either. My wife has told me, more than once through all of this, that she thinks I'm handling it about as well as anyone reasonably could, given everything that's happened over the past decade, watching me go from anger to something closer to tired resignation over these past few months. She also thinks there's a real chance my niece will eventually come around on her own, in her own time, once whatever's driving the anger underneath all of this settles down enough for her to actually look at the situation clearly, instead of just reacting to it. I want to believe that too, honestly. I'm just not sure I'm willing to keep absorbing the same disrespect indefinitely, while I wait to find out whether she's right. My sister and I have leaned on each other a lot through this whole stretch, probably more than we did in the years before it, since we're really the only two people who fully understand the entire shape of this particular grief. Losing a brother, losing a mother, and now watching a niece we both genuinely loved growing up turn into someone who speaks to us like we're strangers who owe her something, rather than family who spent years trying. We talk about it more than either of us probably talks about it with our own spouses, comparing notes and the latest message, trying to figure out together whether we're being too harsh or not harsh enough, whether there's some version of this where everyone ends up somewhere better a few years from now. For now, I've told my niece the door isn't completely closed, but it isn't open the way it used to be either. Not after everything that's happened, not after the way she's spoken about my mother, and not without something real changing on her end first. Some acknowledgement, even a small one, that this entire situation didn't start with me refusing to hand over money. I don't know what that change would even look like at this point, or whether it's coming at all. But I know I'm not the one who has to make the first real move here. Not again. Not after a decade of extending that particular hand in her direction, and getting nothing back except more distance every single time. A few close friends know pieces of this story too, the version I've been willing to share out loud over the years. Mostly late-night conversations after a few drinks, where it all eventually comes spilling out. And their reactions have been mixed in ways that surprise me a little. Some think I'm being too rigid, that family is family no matter how many years of silence sit in between, and that I should have found a way to help with college, regardless of everything else. Others think I've already been more patient than they would have been in my position, that a decade of silence followed immediately by demands for money would have used up whatever goodwill they had left a long time before it got to this point. I don't know that either reaction is wrong exactly, and hearing both sides argued by people who care about me has probably helped more than it's confused me, even when neither answer feels fully complete. Financially, none of this has actually changed anything for my own household, since I never planned around helping her in the first place and never budgeted with that possibility in mind. What's changed is more emotional than practical, a low-grade weight that shows up at random moments, seeing a college-aged kid somewhere and doing the math on what year she'd have been that age. Hearing a song that used to play in my mother's kitchen back when my niece was still a regular presence there. None of it derails an entire day anymore, not after this many months of sitting with it. But it's there, quieter now than it was at first, but present. I also think, sometimes, about what happens if this really is permanent. If the next time I hear from her is another decade from now, under some other set of circumstances I can't predict. Another milestone that suddenly makes her think of the family she walked away from. A wedding, maybe. Or a child of her own someday, wanting grandparents and aunts and uncles her kids never had access to. I don't love sitting with that possibility, but I've made a kind of peace with it being on the table, since I can't control what she decides to do with any of this, only how I respond when she does something. That's a strange thing to have to accept about a relative, that her presence in my life from here forward might genuinely be optional in a way it never used to feel like when she was small and none of this was a possibility yet. I want to say, since people have asked, that none of this has made me love the memory of my brother any less, or made me regret a single day of the childhood she had with all of us before things fell apart. All those years that felt completely ordinary and safe at the time, exactly the way childhood is supposed to feel. Whatever she's become since, whatever anger she's carrying now, doesn't erase the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during family movie nights, sticky fingers from popcorn, completely trusting the world around her in the way only small kids can. And some part of me still holds on to that version of her, even while I hold my ground on everything else. That's the story for today. An uncle who lost a brother, and, in a different way, a niece not long after. A mother whose final years were shaped in part by that same rejection. A sister carrying the same weight in her own quiet way. Kids growing up around the edges of a family story they never got to be part of. And a family still figuring out, a decade later, whether there's anything left to rebuild, or whether some distances just end up being permanent, no matter how much time passes, and no matter how many doors get left slightly open, just in case. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want more of these, and I will see you next time.